The neon sign buzzed above us when my husband leaned close, smiling, and told his friends I should undress for them like it was part of our marriage. As my fingers touched the button of my coat instead of reaching for him, I felt how carefully I'd learned to stay calm beside betrayal. While the neon hum stretched through their laughter, it grew louder inside me, counting every time I'd been treated like something he owned. The same light spilled over my hands as I realized this wasn't a joke between spouses. It was power, rehearsed, and public. That's when I understood our relationship had survived only because I kept swallowing the moments meant to break me. Still standing under that neon glow, I took off my coat and chose the ending he never thought his wife would write. Before we start, I'd love to hear where you're watching from. If you enjoy the story, please hit like, subscribe, and join our community. It really helps us grow. Mark slapped my hip and said, "Gotta keep the merch looking good." And everyone laughed before I even had time to decide how I felt about it. I laughed too, a quick reflexive sound that came out of my mouth before my chest caught up, because at that moment, I still thought he was kidding. I didn't know yet that he meant it exactly the way it sounded. It was a Friday night at the locker room, the kind where the neon beer signs hummed like insects and every TV was tuned to a different game. The air was thick with fryer grease and spilled lager, the floor tacky under my boots. Mark stood at the end of the bar like a mayor holding court, elbows wide, voice booming over the noise. Tyler, Greg, Sean, all of them leaned in, beers in hand, laughing at whatever story Mark was telling this time. I came in straight from my studio, my tote bag still digging into my shoulder, my hands already full of nacho trays the bartender had shoved at me. I hadn't even had time to change out of my work jeans and sweater. As I set the plates down, Tyler let out a low whistle. "Man, Ava," he said, grinning, "those jeans are working overtime." Before I could respond, Mark smirked, reached out, and squeezed my hip like he was checking a melon. "Hey," he said, laughing, "don't touch the product." They roared. Someone slapped the bar. Someone else said, "Damn." The sound hit me all at once, loud and sharp, and I felt my face do that automatic thing. Smile, laugh, wave it off. I made a joke about carbs and stress and how design deadlines were a great diet. They laughed again, satisfied, and turned back to Mark. Inside, I felt myself getting smaller, like I was folding inward one apology at a time. When there was a lull, I tried to contribute something that actually mattered. I mentioned an idea I'd had for reworking the bar's social media visuals, tightening the branding, maybe pitching it to a local sports podcast. I barely got 2 sentences out. Mark talked right over me. "She gets artsy," he said, clinking his glass, "but I make the real decisions." The guys nodded, easy and unquestioning, like that was the most natural division of labor in the world. I stood there with my hands still dusty from tortilla chips, my idea evaporating mid-air. Later, when the rush died down and the bar smelled more like bleach than beer, I found Mark in the back, stacking empty boxes. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, harsh and unforgiving. I told him quietly that I didn't like being talked about like that it made me uncomfortable when he joked about my body in front of his friends. He didn't even look up at first. When he did, he sighed like I'd just asked him to do me some huge favor. "God, Ava, you're too sensitive," he said. "Guys joke like that, you know that." I said I knew, but that didn't make it okay. He laughed, short and dismissive. "You should be flattered," he added. "I still show you off." Show you off? The words sat there between us, ugly and heavy. The drive home was quiet except for the hum of the road and the occasional burst of sports radio. Mark finally broke the silence by telling me I'd killed the vibe, that I needed to learn to take a compliment. He said most guys would have left their wives at home, but he included me. Included. Like I was a perk or a privilege he handed out when I behaved. That word wrapped around my chest like a leash. When we got home, he went straight to bed. I didn't. I slipped into my studio, flicked on the lamp, and stood there breathing in the familiar smell of paper and ink. On the wall hung the framed documents for AR Creative Holdings, neat and official. My name, my signature. Proof that I'd built something real. I stared at it for a long time, trying to remember when I'd stopped feeling like a partner and started feeling like a prop. Today, I know that moment mattered more than I realized. Now I understand that laughter can be a warning, especially when you're the only one forcing it. The first time I reached for his phone and he snatched it away like it was on fire, he laughed it off. My stomach didn't. We were on the couch at home, sunk into that familiar end-of-week quiet where the TV filled the room just enough to keep us from talking. Netflix murmured in the background, some forgettable show neither of us was really watching. A bowl of popcorn sat between us, butter slick on my fingers, the kernels warm against my palm. Mark was leaned back, one ankle hooked over his knee, his phone resting loosely in his hand. It kept buzzing, short, sharp vibrations against his palm. Buzz, buzz, buzz. Each time his mouth twitched into a grin before he even looked. He tapped the screen, read something, and smiled wider. Then, when I shifted closer and glanced over, he flipped the phone face down against his thigh in one smooth motion, like muscle memory. "What's so funny?" I asked, keeping my tone light, casual. I didn't want to sound like I was checking up on him. I hated that feeling already creeping in. He snorted. "Just guys' stuff," he said. "Locker room legends being idiots." He launched into a crude fantasy football joke, something about a tight end and a blowout, clearly meant to derail me. I smiled faintly, but my eyes stayed on the phone. It buzzed again. This time, the screen lit up just long enough for me to catch a glimpse, a tiny image preview before he could tilt it away. A woman, low-cut top, too polished to be accidental. He noticed my eyes flicker. His grip tightened instantly. "Whoa," he joked, lifting the phone higher. "Eyes over here, babe." I laughed, because that's what I always did in moments like that. A quick sound meant to prove I wasn't threatened. "Relax," I said. I wasn't staring. But something had already shifted. The air felt tighter, the room quieter despite the TV. A minute later, still trying to keep it easy, I nudged his arm. "You know it's kind of weird how you hide it like that," I said, half teasing. "Like it's state secrets or something." I reached for the phone, not forcefully, just enough to make a point. He pulled it away sharply. Too sharply. The smile slid off his face for half a second, revealing something hard underneath. "Don't start," he said. His voice dropped. "You know I hate snooping. That's my private space." The words hit me wrong. Private space. From me. I sat back, my popcorn forgotten. "I'm not snooping," I said quietly. "You literally have my phone password. You know my email, my work logins. You read my texts whenever you want." He shrugged, already disengaging, already bored. "That's different," he said. "I actually manage things. You don't need to see what the guys talk about. It'd just upset you." The condescension in his voice was so casual it almost slipped past me. Almost. Like he was doing me a favor by keeping me ignorant. Like I was too delicate to handle reality. I didn't argue. I told myself it wasn't worth it. I told myself this was normal. Men had their spaces, jokes, chats. I told myself not to be the insecure wife. Later, in bed, the lights were off and the room smelled faintly of soap and clean sheets. He lay beside me on his back, phone glowing softly against his face. I could hear his fingers tapping the screen. Tap, tap, pause. Then a quiet huff of laughter he tried to smother. The mattress shifted slightly with each movement. I stared up at the ceiling fan, cutting slow circles through the dark, my chest tight, my thoughts louder than the TV ever had been. Buzz, tap, pause, laugh. I didn't ask again. I didn't turn over. I didn't move at all. All I could think was that somewhere in that chat, there was a version of me being talked about when I wasn't in the room, a version shaped by his words, his jokes, his framing, a version I wouldn't recognize, a version I probably wouldn't like. In my head, I made a quiet note and filed it away like unfinished business. Locker room legends group chat, red flag. I had no idea yet how red it really was. At poker night, Mark told a story about me like I wasn't even in the room, like I was a punchline he could reuse whenever the cards ran cold. We were in Greg's basement, the air thick with stale beer and old carpet. A single lamp hung low over the green felt table, casting everyone's faces in a yellowish glow. Chips clicked together in steady, nervous rhythms. The TV in the corner was muted, some late game flickering silently. I was there because Mark had insisted I come, told me to bring snacks and be social, like those were interchangeable skills. I stood by the kitchen island refilling bowls of chips, wiping my fingers on a paper towel already translucent with grease. No one really looked at me unless they needed something. Mark leaned back in his chair, beer balanced on his thigh, and said, "Oh, you guys remember when Ava lost it before we opened the bar?" He grinned, already enjoying himself. She tried on this dress and flipped out because she thought her stomach stuck out. Full-on spiral. I had to talk her down like a crazy client. The guys burst out laughing. Greg slapped the table. Someone said, "Man, you should have taken a before pic. Use it for your gym promo." They laughed harder. The sound felt physical, like something hitting my chest over and over. I smiled automatically, my face hot. "I'd rather not be a marketing campaign," I said lightly, trying to keep it playful, like I was in on the joke. Mark waved a hand at me without even turning around. "Relax," he said. "You're hot. We're just talking." Then he added, almost thoughtfully, "Besides, Ava knows I like her curvy. She was a flatboard when we met." More laughter, louder this time. My ears rang. I stared down at the chips, the sharp smell of salt suddenly making me nauseous. I felt my body the way you do when someone else points it out, too solid, too present, something to be evaluated. I tried to change the subject. I mentioned a branding project I was excited about, a contract that could really grow my studio. I got a few distracted nods. "That's cool," that didn't quite land. Tyler didn't even wait for me to finish. He leaned forward, grinning at Mark. "So you gonna use wifey as eye candy at that sponsors party?" he asked. "You gotta leverage what you've got." Mark chuckled like it was a compliment. I felt myself disappear inch by inch. The drive home was quiet at first, the dashboard lights washing Mark's face blue. Street lights passed in slow, rhythmic flashes. I watched them and tried to calm my breathing. Finally, I said, "I felt really humiliated back there." He sighed like I'd inconvenienced him. "They're my friends, Ava. They know I'm joking." "That didn't feel like a joke," I said. He glanced at me, annoyed. "Why do you care so much what they think, unless you want their approval?" The words twisted something inside me. Suddenly, my hurt wasn't about his behavior. It was about my insecurity. I went quiet because arguing never seemed to make things better. It just made me feel smaller. When we got home, Mark went straight to bed. I didn't. I walked into my studio, flipped on the light, and sat down at my desk. The room smelled faintly of paper and toner, familiar and grounding. I opened the drawer where I kept old documents and pulled out the bar's operating agreement, the one I hadn't looked at in months. I smoothed it flat on the desk. My name. My LLC. 60% ownership. I traced the numbers with my finger, slow and deliberate. They saw me as decor, a joke, a body to comment on. On paper, I was the majority owner, and none of them acted like it. Today, I understand how dangerous that gap was. Now I know that when people ignore your power long enough, it's usually because you've been taught to ignore it too. Hearing him tell a sponsor, "Don't worry, I got a hot wife to work the room," landed in my chest like a sentence I hadn't agreed to serve. It was a midweek evening at the locker room, one of those nights that tried to feel important just by being quieter than usual. The bar smelled sharp and bitter. Hops, fryer oil, lemon cleaner wiped too quickly off the counters. The TVs were turned down low, sports scrolling silently while Mark leaned hard into his role as host. A couple of local brewery reps had come by, the kind with branded jackets and careful smiles, and Mark was buzzing with that extra energy he got when he thought something might elevate him. I'd rushed there straight from a client meeting, changing in the car into a simple black dress that still smelled faintly of my office. Paper, ink, my perfume, layered over stress. I told myself I was there to show support. The same phrase Mark always used when he wanted me present but not involved. As soon as I walked in, his face lit up. He put an arm around my waist and steered me over like he was positioning furniture. "Guys," he said brightly, "this is Ava, my secret weapon. I bring the beer, she brings the eyes." They laughed on cue. One of the reps, mid-40s, wedding ring, tired eyes, looked me up and down slowly, not bothering to hide it. My skin prickled, like I'd brushed against something dirty. I smiled because I always did, because standing there, stiff and offended, would have been seen as rude. When there was a pause, I tried to insert myself like a person instead of a visual. I mentioned that I'd designed the bar's branding and menus, that I'd worked with printers and suppliers to keep costs down without sacrificing quality. Mark cut in immediately. "Yeah, she does artsy stuff," he said, already turning back to the reps. "Anyway, we're thinking of pushing the IPA harder on game nights." Just like that, I was background noise again. The men nodded, interested now, eyes back on Mark. I stood there holding my drink, feeling ornamental, like something brought out for ambiance, then quietly ignored. Later, when the reps drifted toward the bar, I pulled Mark aside into a darker corner near the back hallway. The hum of refrigerators and the clink of glassware filled the space between us. "I don't like being talked about like that," I said. My voice stayed calm, even though my hands were tight around my glass. "I'm not your showpiece." He exhaled sharply, already irritated. "Do you know how many guys would love a wife they can show off?" he said. "Stop making everything negative." Before I could respond, he leaned closer, lowering his voice. "At the thank you party next week," he added, "maybe finally wear something that shows off what I paid for." For a second, I didn't understand. Then it clicked. The surgery. Years ago. The decision I'd framed as confidence but had been nudged along by his preferences, his comments, his comparisons. "No more grandma dresses," he said lightly. "We've got an image now." The bar felt suddenly louder, harsher. I told him I'd wear what I was comfortable in. His jaw tightened. He leaned in so close I could smell the beer on his breath. "You'll wear what I tell you," he said. "It's my night." The words slid under my skin and stayed there, cold, heavy. I didn't argue. I nodded because that's what I'd learned to do when resistance only made things worse. But something inside me had shifted, quietly and decisively. For the first time, it wasn't confusion or hurt that rose up. It was clarity. This wasn't joking. This wasn't thoughtlessness. It was control. When I got home later that night, the house was quiet, the air stale from being closed up all day. Mark went straight to bed. I went to my laptop. In my inbox, buried under months of unread emails, was an old message from Caroline, my business lawyer. The subject line read, "Protecting your majority interest long term." I opened it and read it slowly this time. Today, I understand why that email suddenly felt urgent. Now I know that when someone starts treating you like an asset instead of a person, it's time to remember exactly what you own and what you don't owe anyone. I didn't find out about the bet from Mark. I found out on a rainy afternoon in my studio when the windows rattled softly and the sky pressed down like it had something to confess. The smell of burnt coffee and printer ink hung in the air. My laptop was open to a half-finished design, the cursor blinking patiently while rain streaked the glass. My phone buzzed on the desk. One vibration, then another. "Sophia, we need to talk now." There was no emoji, no softener. My chest tightened before I even typed back. She was at my door 10 minutes later, hair damp from the rain, shoulders tense like she'd been bracing herself the whole drive. She didn't hug me. She didn't sit down right away. She held out her phone. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly. "I thought you knew." The screen glowed between us. A screenshot. A group chat header at the top. Locker room legends. My name appeared in the thread again and again, casual and cruel, like a toy being passed around. I scrolled. There it was, a cropped photo of me in lingerie, taken years ago in our bedroom. I remembered the night I'd sent it, nervous, trying to feel wanted, trusting that it would live only between us. My face was half visible, unmistakably me. My hands went cold. Tyler had replied, "Damn, man, you won the lottery." Greg followed with, "She gonna model that at the thank you party?" And then Mark, my husband, "Watch me. Bet I can get her to undress for the boys if I push the right buttons." The room tilted. The rain outside sounded suddenly too loud, like static in my ears. My vision narrowed until all I could see were the words, "Undress for the boys. Bet." Sophia touched my arm, grounding me. I barely felt it. Another screenshot, more recent. Mark bragging about the upcoming party, been conditioning her to be more confident. A laughing emoji. She owes me for putting up the cash for the bar. Then the line that made my stomach drop completely. "Wait till you see what she wears under that coat." My face burned. My hands shook so badly I had to set the phone down on the desk. The humiliation was sharp and immediate, like I'd been stripped in public without knowing it. Sophia's voice stayed steady, even though her eyes were glassy. "I thought you were okay with the jokes," she said. "I thought you knew he sent stuff like that. But the bet? Ava, that's not okay." Something inside me cracked open at that sentence. "I thought you knew." I realized how normal it had become. For him, for his friends, for people adjacent to our lives, to assume I consented to whatever Mark did with my image, like marriage had erased my right to privacy, like loving him meant signing away ownership of my body. I picked up the phone again and scrolled further, even though every part of me wanted to throw it across the room. There were jokes about my before and after body, comments about how I'd let myself go emotionally, Mark complaining that I was no fun in bed anymore, speculating that I must be seeing someone because I'd been distant. They dissected my body and my mind with the same lazy entitlement, like both were communal property. I sat down hard in my chair. It creaked under my weight. For a moment, I felt almost numb, like my nervous system had shut down to protect me. Then something else pushed up through the shock. Anger, not explosive yet, not loud, just hot and steady, settling deep in my chest. Anger at Mark, anger at them, anger at myself for swallowing his jokes, for laughing along, for letting discomfort masquerade as normal. I turned to my computer, my fingers moving on instinct. I opened a new tab and logged into my AR Creative Holdings account. Then another folder, documents Caroline had sent years ago, back when my inheritance went into the bar and she'd insisted we structure things properly. There it was, clear as ever, 60% ownership, me, majority shareholder, creative director. And below it, the line I'd forgotten existed. Mark listed as managing member at the pleasure of the majority shareholder. I read it twice, then a third time. He hadn't read this in years. He'd been too busy believing his own version of reality. I looked back at the screenshots, then at the paperwork, then at Sophia, who watched me carefully like she was afraid I might break. "He wants a show," I said slowly, the words surprising even me. Sophia's brows knit together. "Ava." "Fine," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'll give him one." The plan wasn't there yet. I didn't know how or when or what it would look like. But for the first time since I'd seen those messages, I didn't feel powerless. The stage was already set. When I showed Caroline the group chat and the LLC papers, she didn't ask me if I was sure. She didn't ask what I might have misunderstood or whether Mark had meant it that way. She looked at the screenshots once, then at me and asked, "How public do you want this to be?" The question landed heavier than anything else that week. Her office was quiet in a way that felt intentional. A glass desk, clean lines, shelves of neatly labeled binders, the city stretching out beyond the windows in pale afternoon light. No clutter, no softness. I slid my laptop across the desk, my fingers brushing the cool surface, and opened the folder Sophia had helped me organize, screenshot after screenshot. Then I placed the operating agreement beside it, the paper slightly creased from being pulled out of storage too fast. My voice sounded strange to my own ears as I explained what Mark had been doing. Flat, controlled. Like I was reading facts instead of describing my marriage unraveling. Caroline didn't interrupt. She read in silence, scrolling slowly, her brows drawing together almost imperceptibly. When she reached the message where Mark called the bar my baby that I paid for, she let out a short, humorless snort. She tapped the operating agreement with one manicured finger, right where the wire transfer from my inheritance was clearly listed. "He really believes his own PR," she said. She leaned back and reminded me, calmly, of the structure we'd set up years ago when my father died and I'd been too emotionally raw to question anything. 60% ownership through AR Creative Holdings, Mark designated as managing member, subject to removal by majority vote, my explicit right to audit finances, to change bank signatories, to revoke authority. "You're not just the face on Instagram, Ava," she said, meeting my eyes. "You're the owner." Something loosened in my chest at that word. Owner. Not wife. Not showpiece. Not merch. I asked her what would happen if I decided to separate or divorce. The words felt unreal in my mouth, like I was borrowing someone else's future. Caroline didn't flinch. She laid it out step by step, her voice even, almost soothing. Freeze major business accounts. Remove Mark as manager. Negotiate a buyout of his minority stake or restructure ownership if I wanted to keep him involved, which she clearly didn't recommend. File for divorce citing emotional abuse and non-consensual distribution of intimate images. Protect my studio, my investment accounts, my inheritance as separate property. It sounded clinical, efficient, necessary. The idea of making everything public made my stomach twist. Headlines, whispers, people choosing sides. But the alternative, letting Mark keep doing this, keep escalating, felt worse. Caroline didn't push me. She just folded her hands and said, "He already made you public in the worst way. This way you control the narrative." That sentence stayed with me. We talked through next steps, smaller ones, quiet ones, changing internal documents, updating signatories, scheduling a financial review that would look routine on the surface, drafting a notice removing Mark as managing member, ready to be executed if and when I chose. After the party, if I chose. Choice. Another word I hadn't realized I'd lost. When the meeting wrapped up, Caroline walked me to the door. The city outside looked the same as it always had. Cars moving, people crossing streets, lives continuing without noticing mine had shifted. "If he wants to see you as a brand asset," she said almost casually, "fine. Remind him you're the brand owner, not the product." In the elevator down, I caught my reflection in the mirrored wall. I looked tired, pale, but steadier than I had in weeks. Today, I know why that meeting mattered more than any argument we'd ever had. Now I understand that power doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it's been sitting quietly in your name the whole time, waiting for you to remember it's yours. The night I sat in my studio and turned Mark's words into fabric, my hands shook, but not from fear, from focus. The cicadas outside buzzed in uneven waves, their sound slipping through the open window like static. The room smelled faintly of paper, ink, and cold coffee. I turned on my desk lamp, the light sharp and white, and opened Photoshop. My laptop hummed as I dragged the screenshots Sophia had sent into a new file, one by one, lining them up like evidence. Mark's messages, his bets, his jokes, the timestamps. His username repeated again and again like a signature he never thought he'd have to answer for. I zoomed in on the lingerie photo first. My chest tightened for a moment. The memory of how private that image had once felt pressing against my ribs. Then I got to work. I blurred my body carefully, deliberately, soft enough to remove anything explicit, sharp enough to keep the shape and the context. I left my face visible, not out of vanity, out of truth. This was about ownership, not exposure. Next came the chat bubbles. I adjusted the contrast so his words were crisp and undeniable. Merch, product, showpiece. Lines that had once floated past me as jokes now sat heavy and permanent on my screen. I arranged them into a repeating pattern, overlapping texts and reaction emojis, laughter stacked on top of itself until it became grotesque. Dates bled into usernames. His voice echoed visually again and again, impossible to ignore. I stepped back from the screen and felt something settle inside me. This wasn't rage. This was design, control. The same instinct I'd used to build brands for clients who underestimated me. I saved the file and uploaded it to the custom fabric printer I'd worked with for years. The order form blinked back at me, asking for a project name. I typed, Pattern 7A. Nothing personal, nothing revealing. I selected the rush option and paid from my business account without hesitation. They'd signed NDAs before. They didn't ask questions. Professionals rarely do. While I waited, I visited a seamstress Sophia recommended, tucked into a narrow storefront that smelled like starch and old fabric. She was older, silver hair pulled back, measuring tape draped around her neck like a permanent accessory. I showed her the sketch, a simple sheath dress, high neckline, knee-length clean lines. My own fabric, I told her, custom print. She raised an eyebrow, amused. Art project? I smiled. Something like that. She nodded, unfazed, took my measurements, told me to come back when the fabric arrived. At home, Mark wouldn't stop asking about the party. He paced the bedroom while I folded laundry, his voice sharp with expectation. Nothing frumpy, he said more than once. I told the guys you're finally going to stop hiding. I'll wear something you won't forget, I said, keeping my tone neutral. He grinned, smug and satisfied, hearing only what he wanted to hear. Over the next few days, he made little comments about not chickening out, about not embarrassing him, about how everyone was excited. Each one should have made me angrier. Instead, they calmed me. His script was so obvious now. Predictable beats, lazy confidence. Mine was still unwritten. When the fabric finally arrived, I unrolled it slowly across my studio table. The material was smooth under my fingers, cool and perfectly printed. His words repeated across it like wallpaper. My blurred image, his texts, their reactions, layered so densely they became a pattern instead of isolated moments. I ran my hand over it, feeling the truth beneath the surface. The texture was flawless, the truth was not. Today I understand why my hands were steady by the end of that night. Now I know that creation can be its own kind of confrontation. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let someone see themselves exactly as they are. Mark thought the party would be his victory lap. I watched him plan it like a man rehearsing applause, never realizing I was curating the guest list the way a prosecutor lines up witnesses. All week, the locker room buzzed with a different kind of energy. Not the chaotic weekend rush, but a tight, anticipatory hum. Mark strutted behind the bar, telling anyone who would listen about the upcoming private event. A thank you bash for investors, close friends, a couple of local influencers he'd been trying to impress for months. Every sentence ended with the same refrain, how good it would be for his brand. He kept saying he needed me there, needed me to work the room, to smile, to smooth things over. You know how these guys are, he said, tapping his phone as messages rolled in. It's better if they see us together, strong couple, good optics. I nodded, quiet, observant. The smell of citrus cleaner and beer soaked into my clothes as I wiped down a table that didn't need wiping, just to have something to do with my hands. One afternoon, I overheard him bragging to Tyler near the bar's back entrance. The door was propped open for a delivery, letting in a blast of cold air and street noise. I've got a surprise planned involving Ava, Mark said, grinning. The guys are gonna lose it. Tyler laughed and fist bumped him. Man, you always deliver. I felt something twist in my stomach, not sharp anymore, not shocking. It settled into something closer to pity. They were so confident, so sure of the roles they'd written for me. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed and started sending texts. Sophia first. Can you come to the party as my guest? It's important. Please be there on time. She replied almost immediately, Of course. What's going on? I told her only that she'd understand soon and asked her to clear space on her phone. Then Liam. I kept it simple. I need you there. Near Mark and his friends. He didn't ask questions. He never did when my tone shifted like that. I added 2 more friends I trusted, people who'd seen me at my quietest, who knew when to watch instead of intervene. I emphasized where to sit, when to arrive. Details mattered. After that, I drafted a careful email to a local women in business blogger I'd met at an event months earlier. I pitched it as a feel-good story. Small business, community bar, husband and wife team. I didn't lie, I just didn't tell her everything. She wrote back intrigued, asking if she could bring her camera. I said yes. Caroline knew she was coming. That was enough. At home, Mark noticed how often I was on my phone. He leaned against the kitchen counter, beer in hand, watching me type. What are you doing? He asked, smirking. Plotting something fun? I looked up and smiled. I'm making sure people see me. He laughed, satisfied, already imagining something else entirely. 2 days before the party, an email from Caroline popped into my inbox while I was at my studio. The subject line was neutral, professional. Inside were the finalized documents removing Mark as managing member, effective upon my signature, clean, legal, waiting. The timing is your choice, Caroline had written. My heart pounded as I flagged the email. The cursor hovered over the attachment longer than it needed to. Choice felt heavy, but it also felt real. The night before the party, the seamstress called to say the dress was ready. I brought it back to my studio and hung it carefully on the back of the door, covering it with a plain black coat. Under my fingers, the fabric felt smooth but subtly raised, where ink overlapped ink, word over word. I ran my hand down the front slowly, deliberately. Tomorrow, Mark would think he was hosting a celebration. He had no idea he was about to attend a reveal. Today, I understand how quiet preparation can be mistaken for submission. Now I know that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is let someone believe they're in control, right up until the moment the lights come on. When Mark clinked his glass and said, "Ava, baby, don't be shy, undress for my friends," the room chuckled like it was in on a joke. When I slipped off my coat and turned around, the laughter died so fast it felt like pressure popping in my ears. The bar was closed to the public for the night. The lights were dimmed low and warm, the playlist carefully curated, upbeat enough to feel celebratory, soft enough to let conversations overlap. The air smelled like wings, fryer oil, and citrus cleaner, layered with the sharp bite of craft beer. People clustered around high tables, Mark's friends, a few minor investors, the women in business blogger with her camera strap slung over one shoulder. Sophia stood near the back, phone in hand. Liam leaned against a pillar, quiet and watchful. I arrived a little late on purpose, heels clicking against the floor, black coat buttoned to my chin. Calm settled over me like a second skin. Underneath, the dress fit perfectly. High neckline, knee length, structured just enough to hold its shape. The fabric clung where it needed to, and everywhere else it told the truth. Mark's words, his screenshots, my blurred image, repeating like a mural no one had asked to see. Mark spotted me immediately. His face lit up. He crossed the room and kissed me with exaggerated affection, one hand sliding to my waist. "You look hot," he whispered, fingers tugging playfully at my coat lapel. He took the mic with a grin, tapping it once. All right, he said. "My friends have been begging to see what I've been hiding." A few hoots, some laughter. "Ava, come on," he added, amused. "Don't be shy. Undress for my friends." The chuckles rolled through the room, uneven this time. A couple of people shifted. Someone coughed. I looked at Mark. Then I looked at the room, and I said, clearly, "You heard him." My fingers moved slowly, deliberately, unbuttoning the coat one button at a time. The fabric slid down my arms and fell to the floor at my feet. I turned. Gasps rippled outward like a dropped glass shattering. Tyler's face drained of color as recognition hit, his own words printed inches from my shoulder. Greg choked, mid-sip, beer spilling onto the floor. Someone near the bar swore under their breath. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Thick, suffocating. Across my dress were timestamps, usernames, chat handles, Mark's name, phrases like merch, product, bet I can make her strip. The lingerie photo, my face visible, my body blurred just enough to make the violation unmistakable without turning it into porn. The context screamed. Mark lunged toward me, his breath hot and panicked. "What the hell is this?" he hissed in my ear. I stepped back, picked up the mic he'd just used. My hands didn't shake. "This," I said, my voice steady, amplified into every corner of the room, "is what you text your friends about me, about your wife, using pictures I sent you in private." I paused, letting people read. "You wanted me to undress for them. Congratulations. You all get to see exactly how that looks." Sophia lifted her phone and hit record. The blogger's eyes went wide as she realized this wasn't a bar story. It was evidence. Liam shifted slightly, blocking the exit nearest Mark's friends without touching anyone, just standing where he could be seen. "For years," I continued, "you've treated me like merch, like decor." I turned to Mark. "You forgot something. This merch paid for this bar. This showpiece owns 60% of it." I gestured down at the dress. "And this is you, not me." Murmurs spread. Tyler stammered something about jokes. Greg tried to laugh it off, but the words were printed too clearly for denial. The blogger raised her camera and took photos. Careful, methodical. Mark reached for the mic again. I held up a hand. "Oh, and since you like making bets," I said, "here's one. I bet you didn't reread the operating agreement before you started gambling with my dignity." I nodded at Liam. He handed me a folder. I pulled out the document and held it up. "As of an hour ago," I said, "per Clause 7C, I removed you as managing member." Mark's mouth opened, closed. "Tomorrow, the bank accounts change signatories. You can finish your beer on the house." I looked around the room. "After that, it's my house." "You can't do this," Mark sputtered. "You're humiliating me." I looked down at the dress, then back at him, then at the room. "You did that yourself," I said. "I'm just giving you the front row seat you wanted." No one laughed. No one clapped. The silence held. For the first time, the power didn't belong to the loudest voice in the room. It sat unmistakably with me. By the next morning, Mark's version of events was already set. I had lost my mind in public. He repeated it so often it sounded rehearsed. Too bad his words were already out there, stitched into fabric, frozen in screenshots, framed by someone who wasn't married to him and had nothing to lose. I woke up to the low buzz of my phone on the nightstand and the gray light of morning leaking through the blinds. The house smelled stale, like old beer and sleep. I scrolled before I even sat up. The blogger had posted overnight. The headline was careful but unmistakable. "Local bar owner exposed by his own wife." The images were cropped and blurred just enough, no full names, no explicit skin, but the text bubbles were clear. Merch. Bet I can make her strip. Enough context that anyone local knew exactly who it was about. It wasn't viral in the global sense, no trending hashtags, but in our city it was everywhere. Group texts, Slack channels, Instagram stories with vague captions and wide eyes, the kind of story that didn't need to spread far to do damage. Mark had slept on the couch. I heard him before I saw him, muttering, swearing, the sharp inhale he did when he was trying not to panic. His phone lit his face an unhealthy blue as messages stacked up. Investors asking if the article was about him. Friends asking what the hell happened. His mother calling over and over, leaving tearful voicemails about family and embarrassment. He cornered me in the kitchen while the coffee brewed, the machine hissing between us like a warning. "You destroyed my life," he said, voice hoarse. "Over a couple of jokes." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "You shared private photos of me," I said, "and made a bet about humiliating me." He scoffed. "You violated my privacy with that dress." I walked past him and into my studio. The dress hung there, exactly where I'd left it, the fabric catching the morning light. I pointed to it. "Whose privacy did you violate first?" I asked. He followed me back to the kitchen, still talking. He said I had no right to remove him as manager without discussing it, that I'd blindsided him, that this wasn't how adults handled conflict. I took Caroline's printed email from my bag and slid it across the table, smoothing it flat. I'd highlighted his signature from years ago and the clause he'd ignored. Majority ownership, authority to remove the managing member. "You signed it," I said. "You just never thought I'd use it." His mouth opened, closed. He stared at the paper like it might change if he looked long enough. Messages kept coming in. Some of his friends sent apologies that felt more like damage control than remorse. Others doubled down, calling me vindictive, dramatic, out to ruin a man. Sophia forwarded me a message from Tyler. We didn't know he'd actually send those pics. Honestly. As if intention mattered more than impact. As if ignorance absolved participation. The pattern was impossible to ignore. No one was sorry until they were implicated. Around noon, Caroline called. Her voice was brisk, satisfied. The bank had processed the changes. I now controlled the business accounts. She told me the words like a fact, not a celebration. Mark found out an hour later when his corporate card declined at lunch. I heard his phone hit the counter hard. He texted me immediately, furious, demanding to know what I'd done. I replied with the accountant's number and one line. All business expenses now require my approval and receipts. For the first time, his anger didn't make me flinch. My shoulders didn't tense. My chest didn't tighten. It just confirmed what I'd been avoiding for years. He never saw us as partners. He saw me as leverage. Today I know why that realization felt quieter than everything else. Now I understand that when power shifts for real, it doesn't need to announce itself. It just starts working. And when the process server handed Mark the divorce papers at the bar, right in front of Tyler and Greg, Mark smirked like he'd just won a round. "She's being dramatic," he said, loud enough for the nearby regulars to hear. Tyler stared at the TV. Greg suddenly found his beer fascinating. A week had passed since the party, long enough for the shock to settle into rumor, long enough for people to pick sides quietly. Caroline had filed on my behalf with surgical precision. Emotional abuse, non-consensual distribution of intimate images, financial misconduct. The filing was thick with evidence. Screenshots stacked like bricks, bank statements highlighted in yellow, the operating agreement copied twice for emphasis. Nothing vague, nothing emotional, just facts. The server chose his moment carefully. A busy but not packed afternoon at the locker room when the bar hummed with low conversation and the TV volume sat just below shouting. Mark was mid-story, leaning back on his stool, trying to reclaim his old swagger when the man approached. Neutral suit, calm voice. "Mr. Reed, you've been served." The envelope landed on the bar with a soft final sound. A couple of regulars went quiet. Tyler shifted, eyes glued to the game like it had suddenly become life or death. Mark's smirk flickered, then hardened back into place. He laughed once, too loudly, and waved the papers like a joke he planned to tell later. That night, he stormed into the townhouse, the door slamming hard enough to rattle the frames on the wall. He waved the papers in my face, voice rising, pacing the living room like a caged animal. "This is an overreaction," he said. "Everyone shares stuff these days. You're throwing away a good thing." I stood in the doorway to my studio, blocking his usual path without touching him. The light behind me was steady and bright. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I reminded him of the jokes he'd made when I asked him to stop. The way he'd talked about my body like it was a group project. The nights I'd asked for therapy, and he'd said we didn't need a stranger taking sides. The apologies he'd never given, the boundaries he'd treated like suggestions. I told him consent wasn't just a legal checkbox. It was how you treated someone when no one was watching. He scoffed, called me cold, accused me of plotting. His mouth twisted the word like it was an insult. I didn't deny it. I had plotted, quietly, carefully, to survive. 2 days later, his lawyer sent over a settlement proposal. I read it at my desk, the paper smooth and heavy under my fingers. He would keep the bar. He would buy me out at a valuation so low it felt insulting. We would mutually agree to part ways. I would sign an NDA, clean break, even. Caroline read it once and almost laughed. He still thinks he's the main character, she said, tapping the page. He thinks this is a redemption arc. We countered without drama. I would keep majority ownership and managerial control, or I would sell my stake at fair market value. Numbers he couldn't touch without outside money that wasn't coming. He could walk away from the brand he'd poisoned, or we could take this to court and let his texts and the dress photos become exhibits. His choice. The silence that followed was new. When he finally called, his voice was stripped of humor. No jokes, no spin. Just raw disbelief. "You're not the woman I married," he said, like it was an accusation. I stood by the window, watching headlights slide past on the street below, feeling the weight of the day settle into my bones. No, I thought. I'm not. I was the woman he thought he could break. Today I understand why that realization didn't hurt the way he wanted it to. Now I know that becoming someone else isn't a loss when the person you were was built to survive someone else's comfort. Mark loved telling people he'd built the locker room from nothing. He said it like a badge, like sweat and charm had magically turned into walls and taps and payroll. The accountant's report said otherwise, and this time, I wasn't the only one listening. Caroline scheduled the meeting in a neutral conference room downtown, all glass and gray carpet, the kind of place designed to feel fair by being bland. We sat around a long table, me, Mark, our lawyers, the bar's accountant, and a neutral valuator flipping open a laptop. The air smelled like toner and stale coffee, and every sound felt amplified. The click of a pen, the shuffle of paper, Mark's foot tapping too fast. The accountant began without drama. Initial capital, he said, mostly sourced from my inheritance. He pointed to a highlighted line item, then another. Loans issued under my LLC when early cash flow dipped. Design services billed at below market rates. My work, absorbed to keep the bar afloat in its first year. He didn't look at Mark when he said it. He didn't have to. Then he moved on to expenses. Personal nights out coded as client meetings. Travel charges that didn't align with any business purpose. A few uncomfortable pauses while Mark shifted in his chair. Mark interrupted, voice rising. He talked about sweat equity, about nights he'd slept 4 hours, about how the bar was his brand. He gestured with his hands like he could mold the room into agreement. "You can't put a price on what I built," he said. The valuator waited for him to finish, then calmly ran the numbers. Ownership percentages, capital contributions, risk exposure. Without my money and my work, he explained, the bar wouldn't exist in any meaningful way. It would be an idea and a social media account, not a business. I watched Mark's face change as the reality settled in, not all at once, but in layers. First disbelief, then anger, then something like fear. They laid out his options. Secure a loan to buy me out at fair market value, accept a minority, non-managing role with a profit share, or walk away entirely in exchange for my agreement not to pursue additional damages related to the image sharing. He balked at each one. He argued. He tried to negotiate from a position he no longer had. He clung to the image of himself as self-made, as if letting it go would erase him. In the end, practicality won. Or exhaustion did. He signed an agreement relinquishing all management rights and his minority stake in exchange for a modest cash payout, and my agreement not to pursue further claims. The number was smaller than what he'd once spent on a new truck without asking me. His jaw tightened as he signed, the pen pressing too hard into the paper. When it was over, we stood in the parking lot. The building loomed behind us, familiar and suddenly quiet. He accused me of stealing his legacy, the words sharp and desperate. I looked at the bar, the back door where I'd cried after closing, the window where I'd watched him charm customers while I cleaned up messes no one saw. "I'm reclaiming my investment," I said. "Your legacy is what you did with it." He got into his car and peeled out too fast, tires squealing like punctuation. I stood there a moment longer, breathing in the cool air, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief settle into my bones. A chapter was closing, not with applause, not with fireworks, but with signatures and silence. Today, I know why that felt right. Now I understand that ownership isn't just about what you build, it's about who carries it when the story stops flattering you. In the months that followed, I didn't have to tell anyone what kind of man Mark was. His empty bar stool did it for me. The way his phone stopped ringing, the way people glanced toward the door and then away when his name came up. That did the rest. At first, regulars asked about him like it was a scheduling issue. "Mark taking a vacation? He sick?" The staff answered the same way every time, voices neutral, trained. There'd been an ownership change. He was no longer involved. Some customers shrugged and ordered another beer. Others muttered about drama and drifted away, like conflict was contagious. The bar adjusted. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, its reputation shifted. From Mark's place to that spot with the tough but fair lady owner. I noticed it in the small things. Fewer crude jokes shouted across the room, fewer women hovering near the exits, more people staying after games instead of leaving early. It wasn't perfect, but it was different. Tyler and Greg showed up less and less. When they did, they were quieter, like guests instead of fixtures. Tyler pulled me aside one afternoon near the back hallway, the smell of bleach still sharp from mopping. He stared at the floor and said he was sorry things got out of hand. He didn't say sorry for the words, or the pictures, or the laughter, just the fallout. I thanked him politely and went back to work. I didn't need closure from men who only apologized once consequences showed up. Their orbit around Mark weakened after that. Loyalty, I learned, was loud until it wasn't profitable. Through mutual contacts and the occasional social media posts that slipped through, I watched Mark unravel in pieces. He bounced between jobs, managing another bar for a few weeks, consulting for a place that quietly let him go once someone Googled his name. He pitched investors on Locker Room 2.0, all grit and reinvention, but the meetings ended early. The screenshots followed him. The blog post followed him. Whispers about that party followed him into rooms he thought were fresh starts. Online, he posted about betrayal, about being misunderstood, about male victims and cancel culture. The engagement was thin. A handful of younger guys still hyped him up in comments, calling him a legend. But they weren't investors or employers or partners. They were just an audience he couldn't monetize. Without the bar income, his lifestyle collapsed faster than his ego. The new truck he'd bought on a loan disappeared from his feed, then from the street. I heard it got repossessed. He moved into a smaller rental on the edge of town. He posted old photos of the bar, him behind the counter, arms slung around someone, captioned with quotes about loyalty and respect. Each one felt like a plea disguised as nostalgia. Socially, the isolation crept in. Friends with families cooled off. No one wanted to explain to their wives why they were still hanging out with a guy known for sharing intimate photos of his spouse. Invitations dried up. Calls went unanswered. The pedestal he'd built for himself didn't collapse in a dramatic crash. It eroded. Meanwhile, I rebuilt the locker room quietly. We added a code of conduct and posted it by the entrance, not as a threat, but as a statement. I trained staff on boundaries, how to step in early, how to back each other up. We shut down crude locker room behavior the first time it surfaced instead of laughing it off. We hosted women's watch nights, LGBTQ+ events, local team fundraisers. The energy shifted. Revenue dipped at first, then steadied, Then slowly, it grew. Sometimes I stood behind the bar after closing, the lights low, the smell of soap and citrus cleaner in the air, and thought about how different it felt. This was closer to what I'd imagined in the beginning, a place that didn't require anyone to be smaller, so someone else could feel big. Every so often, Liam would pass along something Mark had said about me, that I'd taken him for everything. Liam's response was always the same. She took back what she gave, plus interest. Mark never had an answer for that. I didn't reach out. I didn't correct the record. I didn't push. I didn't have to. Today, I know why his collapse felt quieter than the confrontation. Now I understand that karma doesn't always arrive with sirens or spectacle. Sometimes it looks like empty stools, unanswered calls, and a man left alone with the version of himself no one else wants to carry anymore. The first time a client introduced me as the owner of the locker room, I almost didn't react. It took a second for the words to land. Not Mark's wife, not the designer behind the scenes, just the owner. I felt something loosen in my chest, something I hadn't realized was still clenched. I thought about the woman I'd been, the one who laughed at jokes about her own body because it felt easier than correcting them, and I understood, finally, how far away she was. My days settled into a rhythm that felt earned instead of imposed. Mornings started at the bar, clipboard in hand, checking inventory, greeting staff as they trickled in. The clink of bottles, the low hum of refrigerators, the smell of citrus cleaner and yesterday's beer, it all felt familiar without being heavy. I learned which servers needed quiet encouragement and which preferred direct instructions. I listened more than I spoke. Respect grew in small, consistent ways. Afternoons belonged to my studio. Sunlight pooled on the floor near my desk, warming the space as printers, Word, and emails stacked up. The smell of coffee and ink no longer felt like an escape hatch from my marriage. It felt like a home base. I took on projects I actually wanted, raised my rates without apologizing, said no when something didn't fit. Evenings varied. Sometimes a quiet dinner alone, sometimes trivia night at the bar, watching teams argue over answers while I called out questions into the mic. I hired Sophia to handle the bar's social media. She leaned into what we were becoming. Female-owned, community-focused, zero tolerance for harassment. We didn't make a spectacle of it. No call-outs, no names, just values. We ran a quiet campaign about consent and respect, framed as community standards, not punishments. The response surprised me. Messages poured in. Not loud praise, but relief. Every now and then a woman would approach me at the bar, her voice low, eyes steady. "I saw that article," she'd say. "I've been there. Thank you." Sometimes it happened online instead. Long messages sent late at night. Some of them were still with their marks. Some weren't. I never told them what to do. I told them what I'd learned. Jokes are often warnings, and humiliation is data. Your body reacts before your logic catches up. Pay attention. At home, in a quiet corner of my studio closet, I kept the dress, folded carefully, sealed in a garment bag, not a trophy, evidence, proof of what I'd survived and what I'd chosen to do with it. I never wore it again. I never destroyed it either. If I ever felt myself minimizing a red flag, that fabric was there to contradict me. In quieter moments, I let myself imagine how easily things could have gone another way. Me agreeing to wear what he wanted, staying in the background, letting him keep both the bar and the story. The difference between that version of my life and this one wasn't a dramatic personality overhaul. It was a series of small decisions to believe my own discomfort instead of explaining it away. When people asked if I missed him, I didn't lie. Sometimes I missed the version of Mark he pretended to be, the charming partner with big dreams, the man who talked about building something together. But I didn't miss the man who used my body to score points. I didn't miss being introduced like an accessory. Today I know what it means to be seen without being consumed. Now I understand that stopping yourself from becoming merch doesn't require anyone else's permission. It just requires you to finally take yourself seriously. My husband ordered me to undress for my friends. For a long time, That sentence lived in my body like something unclean. It replayed itself when I caught my reflection in mirrors, when laughter got too loud, when someone looked at me a second too long. But months later, when it surfaced again, the feeling was different. Not shame, not anger, just done. Done performing. Done apologizing. Done pretending I was lucky to be on his stage. It was a quiet evening at the bar, the kind I used to believe didn't count as success. The back room was set up for a small game night. Folding tables, board games stacked unevenly, soft music humming from a speaker someone had brought from home. The smell of pizza mixed with clean wood and soap. No poker table, no shouting, no bets about anyone's body. Liam leaned back in his chair, making terrible jokes about strategy games he didn't understand. Sophia demolished everyone at trivia, buzzing with smug delight as she rattled off answers about 80s movies. People laughed easily, comfortably. No one scanned the room for approval. No one waited to be cued. I wore jeans and a soft tee I'd designed myself. Near the hem, in tiny letters most people wouldn't notice, it read, "Not your merch." I hadn't made it for attention. I'd made it because I wanted the words against my skin. At one point, a regular I'd seen dozens of times, mid-40s, kind eyes, always tipped well, touched the fabric lightly and said, "I like that, feels true." Her voice was gentle, like she understood exactly why it mattered. We cleaned up together after. The scrape of chairs on the floor, boxes folded and stacked, the quiet rhythm of people who didn't feel rushed to leave. When the room emptied, I stood alone for a moment, listening to the low hum of the building settling. This place didn't ask me to be smaller anymore. Today I know dignity isn't about never being humiliated. It's about what you do after the humiliation, who you believe, who you invest in, whose comfort you stop prioritizing. I used Mark's money, my money and my skills to build a life where my body and my image answer to me, not to an audience, not to a husband who needed applause to feel whole. Mark will keep telling his version, that I set him up, that I weaponized his words, that I stole his bar. Maybe some people will believe him. They weren't there when he told me to undress like a party trick. They didn't feel the heat in their face or the hollow afterward. They don't have to live in my skin. I do. The woman who stood on that bar floor in a dress made of his texts was terrified. I remember the way my breath caught, the way my knees threatened to shake, but she still took off her coat. That matters more to me than any court document, any valuation, any clapback. That was the night I learned I could be scared and still choose myself. I locked up when the last light clicked off, the metal sound of the door final and clean. Outside, the night air was cool against my face. The sign above the entrance glowed softly, familiar and steady. The locker room, owned by Ava Reed. Not Mark's wife, not merch. Just a woman who finally understood that the only audience she ever needed to impress was the one in her own head. And she was done laughing at jokes that hurt.